Have you ever set out on a journey without knowing exactly where you're going? Maybe it was a road trip, a move to a new city, stepping into a new stage of life. That moment when the familiar fades and the unknown stretches ahead. It can be both thrilling and it can be terrifying. In many ways, faith is just like that. We don't always see the destination, and the path is mostly uncertain. Yet when we step forward in faith, we trust that God is leading us, even when we don't fully understand where we're going. Today, let's talk about what it means to live a life of faith. Not just a one-time decision, but a lifelong commitment to trusting God, no matter what lies ahead. Faith is a response to God's call. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8 says, "By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he didn't know where he was going." Faith isn't just deciding to do something heroic. It's responding to God's call. Noah, he built an ark in response to God's warning, not to impress his neighbors. Peter, he stepped out of the boat and into the water toward Jesus because Jesus invited him. Faith isn't just about taking risk for the sake of adventure. It's about extreme discipleship. You see, faith is leaving the comfort of the familiar for the promise of the unknown. And if we didn't believe that God's future was better, we'd have no reason to leave where we are. And yet, leaving the familiar can feel risky. But the real risk? Staying put and missing out on the life that God is calling us to. Greg Lavoie describes what happens when we settle. Weeks become months. Months turn into years. One day you look back at a life of deep, honest conversations that you never had. Bold prayers never prayed. Risks you never took. Lives you never touched. You see the person you could have become, but you didn't, because you never got out of the boat. Faith is making your home in God's promise before it arrives. Abraham never owned the land that God promised, yet he made his home there, living in a tent. Why? Because he saw what was coming. Sometimes we have to live in the promised land in a tent, trusting that the city with foundations is on its way. And that kind of faith led a young woman named Jill on an unexpected journey. She put off college to move to Hawaii, then Lake Tahoe. Her family was worried, but what they didn't see was that she was searching for something deeper. She was searching for God. Then came the phone call. She said, "I'm not going back to school. I'm going to Africa." Her parents were shocked. They asked why. And she said, "I want to find God. I'm joining the Mercy ship in South Africa." And despite their concerns, Jill raised the money and went. For 5 months, she lived in a shanty town outside of Durban, serving and searching. And one night, under a starry sky, she told a friend, "I've fallen in love. I'm never falling out. I had found what I was searching for, and when I found him, he had never moved. He wasn't lost. He simply embraced me and said, 'I have loved you all along.'" Jill risked everything in pursuit of God, and she found him. Faith releases your God-given creativity. In Romans chapter 4, verse 17, it says, "God calls things that are not as though they are." God called Abraham a father of many nations before he even had a single child. And to strengthen his faith, God gave him a vision. He said, "Look at the stars, Abraham. Count them if you can. So shall your descendants be." Faith sees what isn't yet, but what God has already promised. One example of this kind of faith comes from the story of George Muller. Muller was a 19th century Christian who ran an orphanage in England, but he did something radical. He refused to ask anyone for money. Instead, he prayed. He believed that if God wanted the orphanage to exist, God would provide. And God did. There were days when the orphanage had no food, no plan, no backup. And then at the last moment, food would arrive. A baker would knock on the door and say he felt led to bring extra bread. A milk cart would break down in front of the orphanage, and the driver would offer the milk before it spoiled. Mueller built 5 orphanages and cared for over 10,000 children without ever making a single financial request. His faith transformed lives. He saw what wasn't yet, but what God had already promised. Faith always looks forward. Abraham never turned back. He knew that God's promise would be fulfilled even beyond his lifetime. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 15 says, if they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. What about you? Where is God calling you to be? In 1803, when Lewis and Clark set out on their expedition, they had no idea the Rocky Mountains existed. Mountains twice as high as any they had ever seen. Right now, there are things waiting in your future. Real things God has planned for you that you haven't even imagined yet. And faith lets us travel beyond the limits of our imagination. And if we could see everything that lies ahead, we might never have the courage to create it. But faith in God's future enables us to endure the hardships to get there. So where is your faith leading you today? Where's the Spirit nudging you to go? Maybe it's time to take that step. Maybe it's time to get out of the boat. I thank you for joining us today. I hope that you enjoyed the message. Maybe it was a message that you were needing to hear. It may have reached you in a place where you needed to hear it today. We invite you to subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook so that you don't miss any of these messages that we're going to be putting out each week. So I invite you, if you're in the area, to join us here in Finksburg at Mount Zion United Methodist Church. Our worship time on Sundays is at 10 a.m. and be sure to join us. God bless.